Assalamu alaikum, dear sisters and brothers. Welcome to yet another episode of the Radio Resistance podcast. As always, I'm joined here by my dear brother and co-host Zubair John. And today we're honored to welcome Ambassador Ashraf Haidari, a distinguished diplomat who has served Afghanistan in various capacities, including as the ambassador to Sri Lanka and Director General of the South Asia Cooperative Environment Program. So with his rich background in international relations and security studies, today Ambassador Haidari brings a wealth of knowledge to our discussion today on patriotism, Afghanistan's national values, and the challenges that we as a nation are facing today. Um, so let's get straight into it. Ambassador Haidari, it's a pleasure to have you here today with us. To start our conversation, I'd like to ask you about the current state of patriotism in Afghanistan. Ever since the fall to the Taliban, there's been a noticeable disintegration of what we call, I guess, national values. Do you think that the concept of nationalism or patriotism is lacking, and how can we rally around national values?
Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to your podcast. Each time I see Afghans run their own shows and podcasts, it really gives me immense pleasure, and I feel inspired and proud. As I've often said, that it's always good for Afghans, especially young Afghan professionals such as yourselves, dedicated to the many causes of Afghanistan, to discuss these issues of immense national importance, vital importance to Afghans in the future of our country. On disintegration of our values, I would not say that our values have disintegrated. The values are very much intact, and also there's no shortage of patriotism. We saw very much over the past 20 years how members of the Afghan National Security Forces fought, especially since 2014, when most of the international forces withdrew from Afghanistan. It's not that we used to pay them a lot; it was probably between $150 to $300, and yet they accepted to lay down their lives and limbs to defend Afghanistan, the future of Afghanistan, our developing democracy, freedom, independence, and sovereignty against external aggression through these groups such as the Taliban and other like-minded terrorist groups. So patriotism is there. Unfortunately, Afghanistan was let down in our pursuit and journey of democracy by our international partners. And because of a lack of resources and enablers, which our security forces needed to complete the work in progress, unfortunately, that the Taliban on the other hand were empowered politically and also militarily by a number of major powers, that they were able to forcefully topple the Afghan government. So over the past 2 years, our people have been traumatized, they've been displaced internally and externally. The country has been hit by state collapse, economic collapse, already abject poverty, climate impact, the back-to-back natural disasters. Unfortunately, they haven't really had the opportunity, and that has already begun, in terms of our people coming slowly together to form advocacy groups, opposition groups, or resistance groups in and outside of Afghanistan to exercise that deep sense of patriotism in terms of their loyalty, support, and defense of Afghanistan's still intact national values, to reclaim, to regain what we used to have before August 2021. To the extent that it has been slow and gradual, I would say that that's because of a lack of pragmatic, visionary, seasoned, energetic leadership. But that's also, developing and developing fast. We are hopeful, we are optimistic, and with unity, that will also, gain strength and then slowly be able to mobilize that deep sense of patriotism among all Afghans of different ethnic, sectarian, religious backgrounds to liberate Afghanistan.
Thank you, Ambassador, and also thank you for joining us as well.
Sure.
I think it's an interesting question, and thank you for that answer. That does make sense. To add on to that, I feel like the patriotism that I see amongst at least the diaspora is a little different than those who are back home. Like you said, people are traumatized, right? By what happened, right? They're upset that their rights were taken away, that everything that we've built up in the past 20 years just vanished in a matter of a day. But I feel like people are also so upset and like they're full of contempt towards at least maybe the previous government for allowing this to happen, right? That this took place. And I think that's where some of at least maybe the younger people that I see have lost that sense of patriotism in a sense, right? Like it's kind of like the old saying, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because just because something, there's an improper government, or a corrupt, vicious, barbaric government in place now, or whatever you want to call them, regime, terrorist organization. Um, just because that's the status quo now in Afghanistan, people, especially like I said, the young youth are stepping away, like as if they're ashamed of being from Afghanistan, that as if the flag had something to do with it, or as if maybe it's the national values were not right, or something like that. Do you understand my point? I feel like
Yes, I do. I think you're right that the youth are disappointed inside and outside, and it's true. I think the leaders of the republic have acknowledged there are many shortcomings. Unfortunately, there rife nepotism and their failure to really tap into the youth and their commitment and their energy and their capacities, especially gained through tertiary education in and outside of Afghanistan. People like yourselves willing to return home and serve Afghanistan, but their failure to recognize that and to invite you to and give you a position of leadership, not necessarily big, but a relevant way for you to serve Afghanistan. Uh, Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and as a result, people with connections of uh, different times were given those positions, who then failed, unfortunately, to execute the key goals of that position in the context of the broader goals of Afghanistan's national security policy or national security strategy, foreign policy of Afghanistan. So when people, especially youth, were observing over time, over 20 years or so, they grew disappointed and distanced. And as a result, they either remained indifferent, or left the country, or in other cases, they were actively recruited by the insurgency, which offered them at least an economic incentive. Those in rural areas where youth had the responsibility of running a family. So out of no option where say the government was predatory at the local level, they had to resort. To other incentives which were illicit and unfortunately not in the interest of Afghanistan. So also Afghans outside It's because I think they're away from Afghanistan, or they've been away for too long. They don't know much about, developments of the past 40 years. So they tend to think and feel ethnically, which is okay if it is, for retaining their local identity, but yet, of course, we all encourage Afghans to maintain their strong national identity, which is Afghan, and also, feel patriotic vis-a-vis Afghanistan and the future of Afghanistan. But unfortunately, that's not what's happening. And oftentimes they either politicize it, or, politics gets ethnicized in a more negative and counterproductive way, which is neither helpful for, the diaspora communities here, nor it is good for Afghanistan. And also the
Hmm.
fact that they're not organized. On and off, they come together, they show up in meetings maybe once or twice a year, and then they walk away. That's also because of a lack of, again, leadership here in the, immigrant communities, lack of advocacy organizations or groups or pressure groups, or, even lobbying groups. If you look at some successful diaspora communities, you could point out, say Armenia or India, and of course even increasingly Pakistan, and they often get together. They have an agenda, with objectives that they discuss. They allow, for democracy to play out, for different people to discuss different opinions from different approaches, with the key goal of, helping themselves here, but also extending that support and help to their mother country overseas. That is yet to happen, and that's also because, Afghans are more recent immigrants. Afghans started going to the U.S. or the West in the 80s. And so they're slowly establishing. They're also more or less concerned with their own problems and issues. We're not as established, say, as Pakistanis or Indians or Iranians who have been here much longer than Afghans. So different factors, but I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic, thanks to, presence and existence of youth like yourselves with vision.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Haidari, for that very insightful perspective. It's interesting to consider the broader context. What Zubair John, what you mentioned as well. So yeah, it's uh, as far as the broader context. What I meant is, not just the Taliban's influence, but bring mentioning the challenges during the Republic era, right? And this just led me to think about the role of multiculturalism and pluralism in shaping our national identity as well. Especially among Afghan youth abroad, right? So, given this like very, I guess, complex, nuanced um, backdrop, how do you think we as a nation, can embrace these principles of multiculturalism and pluralism, um, to be able to foster a more inclusive understanding of those what our national values are, right?
Well, when we say Afghan identity, it's very much underpinned by the many diversities of Afghanistan. We are a pluralistic society. That's why we naturally embrace democracy. There were a lot of people, and still people talk about how, democracy was pushed down or imposed on Afghanistan, superimposed on Afghanistan. I've always rejected that. I say, well, Afghans are very egalitarian, centrifugal, mountainous people, very much like the Swiss, and very diverse. So we naturally embrace democracy, and that's why Afghans repeatedly voted and even risked their lives in presidential and parliamentary elections. We noticed they were threatened literally by suicide attacks and rocket attacks, and yet they always went to the polls and cast their votes to help deepen democracy, and also to exercise their constitutional rights. So for Afghan youth, I think those aware of the core foundation of our identity, which is diversity, pluralism, then the national embrace is just basically respecting and embracing the other, ethno, religious, sectarian Afghans of different backgrounds. We have, Tajiks, we have Pashtuns, you have Uzbeks, you have Hazaras, you have, if you go to the list, there are some now documented 55 different ethnic groups in Afghanistan, different languages, and we need to respect all of them. And there are countries which have successfully respected and embraced and institutionalized their diversity, much like the Swiss. And as a result, they are, strongest nations, strongest in terms of political stability and economic stability, in terms of, coexistence, peaceful coexistence, getting along with one another, simply respecting and recognizing, the existence of each other and the equal rights of one another, across the different ethno-sectarian groups, and as well as both genders. And that's the case more or less among ordinary Afghans, and it's the vast majority of Afghans, minus the elite. It's, I think, the elite problem, not so much the ordinary Afghans problem. Then that's not an issue. That's why the number of intermarriages in Afghanistan have skyrocketed over the past 4 years. In my own family, I have, Pashtun, you have Tajik, Hazara, and Uzbek, and we have seen Sunni and Shia, and that's the case in much of Afghanistan. But outside, again, it's a problem, especially among the older generation, not so much among the younger generation who recognize that, the core strength of Afghanistan is in diversity, and that we need to seek unity or national unity and appreciating and respecting and defending and supporting diversity, who we are. That's what sums up Afghan for me. The totality of our diversities and differences seen and respected constructively.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. That's it's truly uplifting to hear, about the strength that we derive from embracing and respecting our diversity, and also how that ties to our democratic values. That was a very insightful point. I believe this perspective brings us to, you know, another. Many other critical issues that affect
I agree, and so
our
that's why on democracy, Afghans naturally reject the Taliban simply because they're totalitarian. Afghans run away from being controlled. That has never happened in the history of Afghanistan. And that's what even the Taliban have said. They use that often in their propaganda, how, Afghanistan has never been ruled. Yes, if they've never been ruled by people like Genghis Khan or Alexander the Great or the former Soviet Union, or, in their own language, NATO, or whatnot, and then how could Afghans allow this, extremist terrorist group, a strategic project of our neighborhood, to superimpose their totalitarian will on the Afghan people? No way. And that's why we're naturally seeking democracy. We're naturally fighting and resisting and defending democracy. Whether it's in the play now is not an issue, but it is there. It's in every Afghan. And like I said earlier, it only needs to be appealed to and mobilized, and that takes leadership. We'll come back to that again. Leadership to bring that out and use that and continued resistance until we have achieved our collective national goal of restoring democracy and freedom in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was definitely what we wanted to, approach. That was the question, and that's definitely the answer that I agree with. In regards to this, just putting this issue to rest, we mentioned what's happening in general, but we do have to mention often the extreme elements, right? Because there's this broad spectrum, and then the majority of the people are often in the middle, who respect national values, who believe in, a democratic Afghanistan, and the things that we are accustomed to, our geographical integrity, and everything else in terms of patriotism. But then on the two ends of the spectrum, there are extremes, and they're kind of opposite, and obviously in ideals. So one of them, we've seen certain people say that, these are the people who lack the patriotism that I was talking about, and they bring up things such as separatism and these kind of things, which is not in our, I would say, not in our national interest. It's not uh, in the greater good of things. And then on the other end, as also in like a intangible, unfeasible goal, are the like extreme, like ultra ethno nationalists who um, want to like not recognize the current border and take over other, annex other territory and say this is part of Afghanistan. So I think these two extremes are also, and sometimes they get platformed and they get, they are a vocal minority. But what do you think about this phenomena?
Well, I say no to both. Separatism, of course, it's no place in Afghanistan, and historically, we have never had a separatist movement or a secessionist movement. And also, I think the international system, the way it is set up, doesn't allow. It's not viable. It's not possible. Who would accept any small part of Afghanistan? The Pashtuns of Pakistan have moved on. If you talk to them, they strongly identify as citizens, dedicated citizens of Pakistan. See who Pakistanis have put into Afghanistan as diplomats, Pashtuns, who they've put into the NWFP Army Corps yeah, along the Doran line. It's mostly Pashtun military commanders, intelligence likewise, and they're all defending not Afghanistan. They've brought hell upon Afghanistan over the past 40 years. So that I think. Unfortunately, is not helpful. Like you said, it's a very minor group of people that perhaps because of a lack of awareness of the core national security interests of Afghanistan and the place of Afghanistan where it is in the international system and what is legally possible and etc. And so they bring it up more for those reasons than to really help Afghanistan in any way. Separatism, absolutely not. I think platforms like yours, especially young professionals, advocates, leaders like yourselves, I think are best positioned to reject it and to inform and educate people who talk about it, what it really means, separatism, what it really would gain the Afghan people at the end of the day, nothing. We talk about diversity and seeking unity in that diversity, using that negatively separatism to achieve what? Really nothing. And that only plays then in the hands of our enemies, in the hands of our, unfortunately, predatory neighbors who have exploited our diversity to create divisions along, ethno-sectarian lines. We've seen it over the past 40 years to destabilize Afghanistan. And that's why, our neighbor Pakistan is effectively, exploited what I call ideological ethno-religious nationalism. And as a result, the creation of the Taliban as a proxy force to, you know, um, um, exercise that, operationalize that in the Afghan context, and it has worked. And that's why you have the Taliban and there's an exclusionary entity preventing the formation of an inclusive representative Afghanistan that reflects the very makeup of who we are and who, our identity and the effort by the Taliban, this proxy, to erase through this ideological ethno-religious nationalism that very, identity that is based on diversity, pluralism, and democracy that is the essence of who we are, the essence of Afghanistan. So, to irredentism, absolutely impossible at this time when Afghanistan is unfortunately under, I would say, active proxy aggression of our neighborhood. Uh, how are we able to really activate that and achieve it? Impossible. So for Afghanistan to really open the issue of disputed territories that formerly belonged to Afghanistan, and that for that we need to first establish sustainable peace and democracy and prosperity and achieve all the right elements of power so that we are in a position of parity with the countries with which we'd like to open these cases and then negotiate using, and of course, our own laws, and as well as tap into international law, and as well as so many other international legal instruments to properly achieve it. We are not able to do it now by no means. We are barely surviving. At this hour, it's important to focus on resistance to achieve, and to regain what we have lost. Through achievement of an inclusive representative government, which also includes the Taliban. They're reality. They're there. They have to come together with the rest of Afghanistan. There are about 200,000 maybe maximum versus 40 million Afghans uh, with whom they need to reconcile. So one is like to use brutal force, which they have, to silence Afghans. Of course, if we were just on the ground and we had to support our families to survive, we couldn't resist. But this resistance, for sure, would expand and grow if the Taliban continued this heavy-handedness and victimization and brutalization of 40 million who really demand democracy, pluralism, and freedom, and a government that really truly reflect the essence and makeup of our diverse and pluralistic society.
Thank you, Ambassador. So for your point about rejecting extremism, is very well taken, and I think that um, this clear stance is on specifically rejecting separatism as both unviable and contrary to our interests is ever so crucial. Um, the emphasis, the emphasis on unity itself, and the rejection of any of these divisive sort of ideologies, um, that being crucial, right? It brought something to mind earlier, your point about the importance of democracy, and how the overwhelming majority of Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan would, or provingly, have proven that this is in their will, right? Um, Notably, there's a palpable fear of elections when we speak whether about Taliban 1.0 or now, right? Um, and it's interesting, I think, to contrast this with their that consistent aversion to even the idea of elections, and even this just came to my mind of in areas where they have, let's say, ethnic the ethnic majority is the same ethnic group as their majority, right? Being, in other words, in Pashtun majority areas, whether it be provinces or wherever, right? Even in those areas, unless I'm mistaken here, but I've never heard of any such process, election, any sort of, uh, whether it be a referendum, any sort of democratic process to substantiate their popular support, even in those areas that some of these separatists or extremists like to say or claim that, oh well, there they do, you ask them, well, where would you uh, how would you divide Afghanistan on ethnic lines? Well, we'll clearly see that, hey, even in those in many other many of provinces where um, there is a Pashtun majority, they're rejected as well, right? Um, so I think that just that aversion to elections is something that proves this proves this beyond.
I think, like I said, Afghans, Pashtun or non-Pashtun, have always demanded and have always participated in democratic processes. We saw that. I think as much as many foreign experts said, well, illiterate people, mountainous people, what do they know about elections and whatnot? But our people, 40 years of suffering and internal, external displacement, are very resilient and very politically savvy. They do understand the difference between black and white, and they're a lot more informed than some of these educated experts abroad, observers of Afghanistan. So they know the choice. And they saw it. That's why a vast majority of Afghans in rural areas across Afghanistan were sending their girls and boys to school, especially the girls. And they were encouraging them to not just stop at a school, but move on to go to universities. And that's why under the, Taliban first time around, you had probably a few hundred thousand Afghan boys only going to schools, and then a very small number going to a few universities. But you saw that millions of girls went back to school, and hundreds of thousands of girls went on to universities across the country, not only to public universities, but increasingly private commercial universities. And now those families and areas where the Taliban feel that they're dominant ethnically, which is wrong. Even in those areas, if they have an opportunity to send their girls abroad for education, they do so. If they have an opportunity to emigrate through whatever programs that are still around, they would take that opportunity so that their girls could continue getting an education. So extremism is completely rejected. Afghans, our Islam is very much mixed with customs, traditions, and cultures of our diverse society. As a result, very moderate Sufism in Afghanistan as a cradle. It's the birthplace of Sufism, which is spread from Western Afghanistan, Herat, to the rest of the South Asia and the subcontinent, spreading the moderate word and the true tolerant message of Islam and the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, all of which, unfortunately, the Taliban and those that support the Taliban violate. And that's why, several delegations from the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, scholars from the member states of OIC have visited Afghanistan, and they have also passed fatwas and issued declarations calling the Taliban's bans on secondary education, tertiary education, and isolation and exclusion of women from Afghanistan's polity, society, and economy un-Islamic. So it's neither cultural nor Islam, nor anything Pashtun culture. Pashtun culture, very egalitarian. If you see women in provinces where Pashtuns are dominant, they actively work. They go out and spend hours and hours as nomads, helping their husbands, male members of the family, to provide a livelihood for their families. So what you see in the Taliban is, like I said, is a proxy, a combination of things in the name of, unfortunately, Islam and culture superimposed on our nation. And strategically, I see it as a way to ensure dependence of Afghanistan, to blunt and to prevent Afghanistan from developing on a sustainable basis and to achieve dignified and sustainable peace. I really see it in that strategic calculus as opposed to anything religious or anything cultural, because the Afghan culture rejects what the Taliban have been doing, and Islam is very clear on education and social development, economic development, and whatnot. And that's why the proverbs and the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, gain knowledge even onto China. China at the time was the farthest from Mecca. So, learn from cradle to the grave is another, prophet saying, which all of which the Taliban unfortunately violate and violate other, core tenets of Islam. And so that's why the Afghan people naturally reject the Taliban and seek, freedom and liberation from this totalitarian, ignorant, dark force superimposed on Afghanistan.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. Um, it's clear, it's beyond clear, it's beyond evident that the majority do seek a future that the Taliban's regime does not align with. I really appreciate that point on the education. Parents, the desire of the parents to educate their children. And we see it even despite today's circumstances, right? All the underground schools and um, uh, every home is a school indeed in Afghanistan today.
Well, I mean, just
But
one fact. I mean, without STEM education or modern education, how is it possible for Afghanistan to develop and be peaceful? Impossible. Look, other members of the OIC countries, right, in the Middle East, patrons of the Taliban, in other cases, Qatar, for example, or United Arab Emirates, they have recently been sending satellites and hoping to, explore the universe and send satellites or rockets to the moon, which is underway happening. How is it that those Islamic societies are doing those things consistent with, the teachings of the Holy Quran, where it is very clear that God says that you have to go and explore the universe. And that exploration needs what? Modern science, technology to achieve. And that's what the UE and others are exactly, following. But here we have, an entity superimposed on Afghanistan that is seeking to take Afghanistan back to the Stone Age, from which or even before the 7th century, unfortunately, which Prophet Muhammad was chosen to save the people of Arabia from infanticide, which was unfortunately the killing of female babies, which now the Taliban are more or less committing by the enforcement of this gender apartheid, isolating Afghan women, unfortunately. So clear, I think, rejection by the Afghan people. That's why they're internally illegitimate and externally illegitimate and lacking any recognition, because no country can bring itself to recognize this given what they have signed up to, the international laws and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and related instruments. And as a result, the Taliban would remain a pariah entity until and unless they reform their mindset and come back together with the rest of Afghanistan.
thank you. Absolutely, Ambassador. It does starkly contrast with the realities imposed, as you said, by the current regime. You know, turning to another a very pressing concern, Pakistan's recent decision to expel 1.5 million Afghan refugees. That poses serious challenges. Ambassador, what are the implications for Afghanistan, and how should we, along with the international community, respond to this significant humanitarian issue?
First of all, that's a gross violation of the 1951 Geneva Convention related to the status of refugees, refugee law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and as well as Islamic law. Islamic law is very clear on migration, and we know about the migration of Prophet Muhammad in search of security and safety. and Islam is very clear, and the principle of non-refoulement and expulsion or forced deportation is rooted in Islamic law as much as in the rest of international laws, which unfortunately the Pakistani government is currently committing. And it has been called out by various related UN agencies, especially United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, almost every day recently has been putting out statements condemning and calling on the Pakistani government to halt these forcible deportations in large numbers during winter, at a time when Afghanistan is hit by climate impact, by repeated natural disasters, earthquakes. We saw not just in western Afghanistan, but a few months earlier in south of Afghanistan, and poverty. Unfortunately, the fact that there is no government that can really provide them with any kind of survival assistance on arrival, but then of course reintegration, because each time a refugee returns, he or she or the family needs to be reintegrated so that they can restart a successful, productive life, which doesn't exist even for the existing population. That's why you have in ongoing exodus of Afghans leaving Afghanistan simply because there are no jobs and they cannot provide for their families. So it's tragic what Pakistan is again doing to Afghanistan. That's one side, and the international community has come out and condemned that and has been calling on Pakistan to halt. And we encourage again the international community, major stakeholders, partners, friends of Afghanistan, and countries such as the United States to use their leverage and influence, which is overwhelming over Pakistan, especially these days when Pakistan is politically unstable, security-wise, now increasingly threatened by their own creation, by their own, unfortunately, strategic blunder in Afghanistan, and as well as financially. They're really dependent on the support from IMF, without which they couldn't really hold their economy together. So that leverage is there for the United States to use and have the Taliban halt these deportations. That's one. Second, there's also security concern. We don't know, with the Taliban in power, who among these deported refugees are. Say, of course, they're legitimate, impoverished Afghans being deported, but there could be also among them terrorists who may not necessarily be Afghan, but could be well-trained terrorists sent to Afghanistan for a variety of purposes, not only to destabilize Afghanistan, but also to threaten regional stability and security, something that I call the attention of our neighbors, and encourage them as a result to halt these large-scale deportations until the situation and the pull factors have become available, and until the Afghans themselves have decided to return voluntarily, consistent with the provisions of the tripartite agreement between Afghanistan and Pakistan and your United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which again provides for voluntary repatriation of Afghans, not against their will. If they're able, then yes. And if the conditions on return are there, yes. Otherwise, not. So, I'm concerned about that, and that's why I think that from a security perspective for Afghanistan, but also for our broader neighborhood and the rest of the international community, meaning international peace and security, I think major players and powers with influence over the top Pakistan should help halt this.
Yeah, that's actually the point where you said we don't know who's among. We also don't know who everyone is that's coming in. I mean, we did see um, that there were people from every ethnic group that was coming in, and that's unfortunate because that's when we know that they are our people are amongst them for sure. I mean, 1.7 million people, that's a lot of people. But at the same time, we can't, like you said, ignore that reality or that possibility of there being other people in amongst them that are not in the they wouldn't be for the interest of Afghanistan. And we actually had a podcast episode on this where we mentioned the TTP, at the Taliban agreeing with making a deal with the TTP, and um, you know taking their families as well and putting them in the northern regions, and providing for them, and establishing ties with them. So I think
The
that's
same thing
actually
as settler colonialism, right? Ultimately, as you,
yeah,
I believe, had framed
we
and
said it
phrased it
then.
as,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah.
exactly. So it's like, yeah, we were mentioning how people are outraged at that in other parts of the world, but when it comes to Afghanistan, it's ignored. So yeah, I think that's actually a very interesting
And that
point.
doesn't
And
help. I think if
go ahead.
there is some kind of understanding between the Taliban and the Pakistani government, of course, the Taliban criticizing verbally but doing nothing about preventing it from happening, and yet then placing some of these people in areas where the original existing communities do not welcome, that automatically creates instability, of course, where in Afghanistan, and that's not helpful. And that's the last thing that Afghanistan really needs: increased instability from this relocation of people not familiar with the local communities, of course, with no jobs and so much else that unfortunately went as a result evolved. It's not that, of course, Afghans are not welcome in any part of Afghanistan. They are, but who they are and why they would put there in one place versus where they could more easily reintegrate practically speaking. I think if to the extent that that's happening or is going to happen, I think that's something that's definitely not, I think, um, helping Afghanistan to stabilize. But also, I think if there's an external component to place some mostly, male armed, trained, ideologically indoctrinated fighters in northern Afghanistan, along Central Asia, then I think those countries need to watch that. That's not just simple, ordinary Afghan families, but these are fighters disguised as returnees, which
Mhm.
then could suddenly pop up and operate an incursion into some of those territories. So I think it's its regional implication as much as internal, and that's why I think Afghans should watch this and speak about it, and as well as our neighbors should watch this very closely, foremost for themselves, but also broader regional stability that which every country needs in the region, but also Afghanistan.
Right, right. And one of the things that you said as well is when these people are relocated in areas that the local communities are not, you know they're not familiar with their culture, and that causes, like you said, instability. But I feel like that's purposely done to cause division, right? Because that's the easiest way for any oppressive government or ruler to rule over a people, is to keep them divided. So speaking of division, I want to get to the next question, which is actually discussing the opposite of division, where we see the opposition to the Taliban mobilizing, both in Afghanistan militarily and outside of Afghanistan politically through civil society. So these opposition and resistance groups, how do you think that they can gain further legitimacy and ultimately be successful? What do you think about that? And maybe we can tie in some of the things that we mentioned earlier as well.
And
Well,
if you
there,
don't mind, I just wanted to add one thing to that question there. If you could also approach it from a local and also diaspora um, perspective as well, because I think the abilities of each are a little bit different, right?
yes, I think the collective cause is common. It's there. It's legitimate. Our cause is just reclaiming what has been lost to liberate Afghanistan from new claws of these extremist terrorist groups, which by no way would help Afghanistan achieve anything sustainable: peace, development, shared prosperity, coexistence, internal, external. It's not in our interest. It's not in the best long-term interest of our neighbors, and that's why I've always tried, even when I was attending meetings or heading delegations, and I did twice. The president sent me to the early or initial Moscow format meetings where it was at the deputy foreign minister level, but we had a little bit lowered our rank, and I was director general from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and actively, substantively participated. And I told all of them, especially Russia, China, and Iran. And they're already seeing the consequences of their then support for the Taliban to come into power. And they're actively now courting the Taliban on the one hand, but they're also very concerned about the Taliban. And that's why they're sending messages to the Taliban, including through the recent Moscow meeting, that if they fail to form an inclusive representative government, then of course resistance would grow, which means that certain countries in the region then would, get active against the Taliban. And so back then, and for years, we've been warning, foremost Pakistan itself, that it's in your, best long-term interest not to support or pursue terrorism and extremism as instruments of foreign policy in the Afghan context, or to use others, one extremist terrorist group against another that is also not in your best long-term interest. What is in your best shared long-term interest is to strengthen the Afghan state. It's a modern state, just like you, and with a nation in the current international system, that you can work with a state like yourself, but you cannot work with a rental pariah terrorist criminal group, because today you rent him, tomorrow another country will rent him with more resources and will use it against you. And as a result, you should strengthen our end in the peace process. Back then, we had a process which unfortunately was undercut by the Doha deal and didn't allow a peace process. It wasn't a peace process; it was more of a withdrawal process where U.S. dealt with the Taliban, withdrew, and return allowed Afghanistan to fall in their hands. And so um, is that answering your question?
Yeah, but I guess in more recent, like you mentioned the Moscow conference, but one of the we saw in the Herat security dialogue,
Mhm.
different. It was pretty much many different actors and players, representatives from anti-Taliban, the opposition. So what, I guess, do you think what they're doing currently is it enough, or are they do they seem unified, or is there any deficiencies?
Exactly. I
What's
think the point that I forgot to make, I diverged a little bit,
it's okay.
is that there's a collective cause, um, and and both internal and external, and the broader resistance or opposition. But again, here, unfortunately, a lack of leadership, which can really bring all these different opposition groups and resistance under one umbrella, because the goal is common. Maybe, of course, there's some differences here and there in terms of what kind of government, who, etc., the constitution and the makeup of the constitution, the revision of the Islamic Republic constitution, and that doesn't need much revision except to, you know, put more provisions for decentralization or devolution of power from center to periphery, which also President Karzai recently did an interview and highlighted the importance of doing that, to put more power in the local governments, so that we move away from this overly centralized system traditionally, which unfortunately is dysfunction and failed to deliver on the basic expectations of our people. And we, again, experimented over the past 20 years, and it failed. But I think leadership, there are too many voices that go to different conferences, speak more or less with the same language, but they fail to rally around a common leader, which I, alluded to. We should have the right characteristics. We should be a visionary, and at the same time very pragmatic and aware of internal and external situations, and should be seasoned. It's hard to find, but we do have such leaders, and they're already in the play. Maybe they lack, certain qualities here and there, but I think they're aware. They're listening to people like us, and they're listening to the rest of the Afghan people and their demands, and they can adjust. They can learn. They can catch up. They can, bring the bright minds around them, not keep them at a distance, and mobilize and organize and institutionalize, and then manage all for results, and then appeal to that, their feelings of deep patriotism. Like every Afghan at the end of the day, if it is Pashtun, Tajik, Hazara, Uzbek, Turkmen, Baluch, Aimaq, Sunnis, Shia, and a 7 or 12er, they're deeply, deeply, deeply patriotic, and their demands are very basic. They want what? Sustainable peace, sustainable prosperity, sustainable national unity, a secure future for their children, and for Afghanistan to be rid of the problems and the interventions and the invasions and so much misery and suffering that have come with those externalities of the past 40 years. That's what the Afghan people want. That's what the ordinary Afghans want. And the cause is very clear. Suffering, we have unfortunately suffered more than enough. Probably there's, maybe Afghans have suffered the most, over the past century. So leadership, and those leaders to listen to younger leaders like you, and to take you to seriously. And that's another problem, unfortunately, that oftentimes young leaders or youth are taken for granted. And I see in some of these conferences that the youth should really be there, the face of this conference, because they have the vision, they have the capacity, the insight. Now, of course, the utilization of technology that can really help us leapfrog into this process of regaining what we have lost and rebuilding Afghanistan, but also, of course, tapping into experience. And often it's negative, but the youth can look at that, pick up the right experience from the elderly, from our senior citizens, but leave their baggage behind. That's not, unfortunately, again, happening because of a lot of group interests or personal jealousies, insecurities, and and whatnot. And again, it's then our job to really navigate through and to bring to the attention of rising, potentially strong, capable leaders to address those issues and to bring our patriotic people together, those inside and as well, especially those outside, because over the past 2 years, unfortunately, what has happened also tragically is Afghanistan suffered from a massive brain drain. Now, the brain of Afghanistan is effectively outside. It's in places in New York and Washington, Virginia, across the US, across the Europe, and Australia, Canada, all those places where they used to have forces in Afghanistan and have evacuated. So then the leadership should not only be for Afghans inside Afghanistan, but also to bring that broken, now scattered brain back together on the civilian political, but also on the military as well. Because remember, we had the ANDSF with probably the best special operations forces in the region. That I remain very proud of. I still don't think that our region has the kind of quality of the special operations forces that Afghanistan used to have, and in this able to quickly operate and neutralize those very complex suicide attacks. If it happens, God forbid, in any of our neighboring countries, they will lose it. I mean, even Pakistan. We saw what happened in India back in 2008. That a few suicide terrorists were able to basically put India on international TVs for days. While in Afghanistan, we saw that our special ops forces were able to just neutralize these within hours. So they're there. They're in different parts of Afghanistan. They're outside of Afghanistan. That leadership is needed to mobilize, bring them back to find the resources as well. And then once the international community also notices this, and that's why they often ask that you Afghans are not united among yourselves. We saw the cause, we identify with your values, we helped you, for so many years. Part was our problem, part was your problem. Unfortunately, we discussed is corruption, nepotism, uh, very self-destructive, shades of ethno-religious nationalism, even back then, ethnic nationalism. I was a victim of that. I was a very victim of ethnic nationalism. That people in major positions of power knew me very well, and they're around. They know me. They knew that I could do a lot more for Afghanistan, but unfortunately, they wouldn't give me the right position to do X, Y, Z for Afghanistan simply because I didn't belong to a certain ethnic group. That my last name didn't end with a certain suffix and whatnot. That new leader should get rid of all of those and assure every Afghan of every ethnic group of every sectarian religious background that you are Afghan. We're all Afghans. This is our country, the territory that we are in. And unless we come together, work together, do our part. You don't have to be in Afghanistan to fight, or you don't have to, be in Afghanistan to run an institution. Where you are, right in Virginia, New York, you spend 1 hour a day on Afghanistan, work and spend $200 to support a family in Afghanistan, and etc., etc. All these, drop by drop, we make a river, drop by drop, we make an ocean. And that power of nation is the power of the Afghan people against, like I said, maximum 200 superimposed extremist terrorists with no vision, with no future for the Afghan people or for the region or for the rest of the world. The world is potentially on our side. That's why they came, helped us. Of course, foremost out of self-interest, but it was our shortcoming of our leadership, and then unfortunately failed to take advantage of that opportunity. It was a long time. That's why it's called the longest war. It came with many problems and challenges, which we have endlessly discussed, but that was also an opportunity which these leaders squandered simply because they couldn't tap into our own, human resources, couldn't mobilize them, couldn't organize them, couldn't institutionalize them to create the lower middle management and the upper management, and to then marshal all of them to defend Afghanistan against what was very clear coming from our neighborhood. And the SIF was failed. The leadership was politicized along ethno-religious, mostly ethno-nationalist lines, and as a result, they weakened and then they moralized once the international community withdrew. So a strong, patriotic, nationalist Afghan that reject all these issues of separatism and irredentism completely to be shelved until we stand on our own, we're strong, and then we can open those, um, you know, legally under international law, and then see what we can do. That's the kind of leadership Afghanistan needs. Servant leader, meaning becoming a founding father, which we failed to become. And that's why each time I go to these different countries, capitals, what I really pay attention is these sculptures. You see, a man with a sword on a horse. I just go and see who that individual is. And oftentimes you see that as a founding father, a leader, different from others. So many came, died, forgotten, but there's sculptures there because he did something different. He made money sacrifices. He put national interest before his self-interest, personal interest, group interest, family interest, ethnic group, interest. And so that's the kind of leader we need. That's the kind of, I think, leader our growing national resistance needs, and political resistance needs. And they're there, people like yourselves, inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan. And I ask people of our own to give these Afghans an opportunity and empower them and enable them and work with them to bring out the best of our people against the status quo and to reclaim what we've lost.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. Reflecting on your points, I think there's a broader context to consider here as well. Um, of course, I agree. Well, internal unity and leadership are, without a shadow of doubt, important. Um, I think that there have been calls for unity and also the effective leadership, within the resistance. There are leaders who have been consistently advocating for this unity and mobilization, right? Um, and that within that broader context, yet the international community's support has been limited of Afghanistan's democratic forces, right? You made mention that as well, especially within the U.S. Current U.S. administration. With, let's just call it, their focus on the Taliban, or I mean, President Biden himself pretty much admitted a partnership of a sort on counterterrorism. So, before closing here, I just wanted to ask: do you think that the lack of international backing, rather than it being more of a shortfall in leadership, is or it that itself is more of a significant barrier to resistance success? I don't This isn't to take away from the or to dismiss um uh self the right to self-determination, and it being a self our national resistance being, of course, um grassroots as it is and as it has been, right? But uh, how can the resistance overcome these geopolitical challenges? Because I feel what I'm trying to say essentially is that I feel sometimes that it's an excuse. It's an easy way to
No, you're
excuse.
right. It's external, and in international relations, we know that nations basically work in their self-interest. Again, in our context, then it's a leadership challenge, right? How to bring these different nations seeking their own self-interest in the international system and our support. And the challenge is how to convince them on shared values, shared interests, not short term, specifically long term, and drawing on lessons to be learned. Especially the United States was very much engaging with the Taliban, and that's in the 1990s. And Ambassador Khalilzad wrote actually a piece on fully engaging with the Taliban. Back then was the project of Unicol and the TAPI and whatnot. TAP at the time is Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan Pipeline, specific project on which they wanted to engage with. But they saw how that backfired. Even that engagement didn't materialize fully before the Taliban sheltered and enabled Al Qaeda to mastermind 9/11. So then 9/11, and then of course re-engagement in Afghanistan with the people of Afghanistan to establish a democratic government, which progressed and achieved also significant transformative gains. But then it was abandoned, unfortunately, because of the Doha. And we also discussed our own shortcomings, how that hastened the process of, I think, withdrawal of NATO forces from Afghanistan. Now, again, the leadership challenge right now is how to work with these, I would say, opposing nations in the region and as well as beyond the region. How to basically, if we just, let's say, focus on the permanent members of the UN Security Council, the P5, Russia, China on one side, and the United States, France, and UK on the other side. Now, definitely opposing each other on north south, east west issues, especially in the Indo Pacific region. And how to make Afghanistan relevant, and is very relevant to their priorities under the Indo-Pacific agenda. Something that I was hoping that the recent conference in Dushanbe would focus at least some of the Afghans there. And I put out a tweet and even underline two analytical questions for the Afghan speakers to discuss, because that's what ultimately North-South policymakers, East-West policymakers, and as well as US presidential hopefuls seek. What is it? What is in this for us? Why shouldn't we engage with the Taliban, engage with your support, you and your resistance, as much as it is for democracy and freedom and other values that we share? Because they really prioritize their self-interest. It is short-term. It's going to backfire. They've learned it not from Afghanistan and other interventions. But we have the HAPRAN, and that the people of the United States really support us. And that's why they send their sons and daughters to fight alongside AND SAFE to help institutionalize democracy, human rights, women's rights, and so forth. And now, again, the leadership challenge is how to, again, mobilize and organize and support advocacy groups and work with advocacy groups and capitals like Washington to reach out to the members of the United States Congress whom are responsible to their constituents as taxpayers and voters whose hearts and minds are not with the Taliban. Every American mind and heart is with, that of our people desiring and demanding democracy and freedom, women's rights and human rights. And it's still in that name that the United States is providing now some $3 billion in humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. So that, again, the leadership challenge is how to connect with the West on those shared values and how to connect with the East. Look, with President Xi of China, if our leaders, potential leaders are watching, they must have paid very close attention to the meeting, the summit between President Biden and President Xi, or former President Trump and President Xi on shared issues of interest and concern. And Afghanistan is always there. Afghanistan, unfortunately, the Taliban remains a growing source of extremist, terrorist, criminal threats, foremost threatening, major global supply chains, not only, of course, of China or Russia or India, which now India is strategically a partner of the United States, but also the United States itself. How to work with the private sector of the United States to ensure the safety, security of those, supply chains and whatnot. So here, I think the leaders, where they come together and organize, come up with a strategy, one that is dynamic, one that is adjusting for all these, one that works within these differences. On the one hand, of these opposing players, whether a history in Afghanistan, what the continued interest in Afghanistan, and as well as their shared interests. If you look at, the volume of trade between China and India, they talk about these antagonistic terms, but it's over $100 billion. They're, feeding their populations through increased shared interest in trade, or the volume of trade between United States and China. So it's not that these countries are going to fight each other in tension. No, they also try to avoid confrontation and engage in cooperation in Afghanistan is still, I think, a place more for cooperation between East and West, North and South than confrontation. It's in their shared best long interest to help rationalize the status quo by formation of an inclusive, representative government. It's going to serve China's interests, Russia's interests, India's interests, United States' interests, and Europe's interests. For Europe, the flow of drugs, the flow of migrants, the flow of all these youth that they're, turning back to Afghanistan will stop. There is an immediate dividend of, helping rationalize the status quo so that Afghanistan stabilizes and stands on its own, so that Afghanistan is the heart of Asia, the land bridge between South Asia and, Central Asia, really helps China and Russia and India, three of our bigger neighbors, achieve their shared common goal in connectivity. That's connectivity is one that they're all seeking under different labels and names. For China's Belt and Road, and how is it possible that China's Belt and Road would be completely achieved without, and Afghanistan is safe and secure, from which, TTP and others are not trained and not indoctrinated and supported by the Taliban to, undermine, sabotage $60 billion in investment of China in that part of the Belt and Road project in Pakistan alone. So it's in everyone's interest to do away with the status quo, to bring them into the fold. We do, of course, acknowledge their existence, and those smart, patriotic Taliban leaders must also listen to me as an Afghan, that your interest and the interest of your families, in your villages, in your communities, and Afghanistan, the future of Afghanistan, is not and being what you are and what you've been doing over the past 2 years in forming an inclusive representative government where you have a role to play to contribute to Afghanistan's long-term stability and peace and pluralism and democracy, where all Afghans, we all live together, not against each other, not resisting against one another, not destroying Afghanistan anymore, unfortunately, which we have been doing over the past 40 years, being played in the hands of entities that have rented you, the Taliban, against 40 million Afghans. That's my appeal to the Taliban.
On
That's.
that,
Go ahead, Kumail. Did you have a comment, or should I jump in?
yeah, no, I just wanted to say that that was very, very eloquently said, Ambassador. Also, it just on that note reminded me of a, um, speaking of leadership, the leader of the one of the resistance groups, the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan, um, uh, Ahmad Massoud, he recently said in an interview. I mean, he's stated this numerous times, but he emphasized this again that well, in his words, I emphasize that I'm not in favor of aligning Afghanistan with any of the world's powers or military blocs. We want Afghanistan to adopt a policy of friendship with all and enmity with none, in harmony with the region and the world, based on internal consensus and national stability. You know,
Exactly,
summed up version of exactly what you
and that's
also.
that's that's
Yeah.
that's who Afghans are. We're really non-aligned, but we're multi-aligned, in friendship and mutual respect and reciprocal give and take and working with others, internally, of course, with one another, but also externally with others uh, to ensure a shared peace and security and prosperity. And that's exactly what these sustainable development goals demand, adopted under the United Nations auspices by all member states. That without cooperating, collaborating, partnering with each other, especially in our immediate neighborhood and broader region and the wider world, it's really hard for the humanity to achieve those goals. Afghanistan being landlocked, we have no agenda whatsoever to threaten anyone, that our ultimately shared peace and prosperity depend on the shared, the peace and prosperity of our neighborhood, and beyond our neighborhood. So that's why we were actively promoting and participating in the Heart of Asia Istanbul process. It was an excellent platform initiated by the Turkish government and full partnership and ownership and leadership of Afghanistan. And the purpose was very much to bring a wider neighborhood to help stabilize Afghanistan, both economically, politically, of course, and as well as security wise, so that this space is an area of shared peace and prosperity, could benefit the whole region and the wider neighborhood.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Zubarjan, I'm sorry. I think I interrupted you earlier. Was there something that you wanted to add before we start closing?
No, actually, I had that same thought in mind when Ambassador brought up the like multi-alignment policies and stuff. So that same thing came into my mind, and I remember that's something me and you had discussed, Ambassador, at the Global Friends of Afghanistan conference as well. I remember you were giving me some tips and insight on that. So, um, but basically, no. To close this off, I would say everything that you said was well taken. And when you mention, it's your humility that when you say young leaders like yourselves, but I would say that say that right back at you, because it's we look up to leaders like yourself who are selfless, who are patriotic. That's the reason why we, to be honest, the first person that came to my mind, I was like, who could we bring on for this subject? And I was like, there could be no one better than our own ambassador. And this is why, what you said is true, but it reflects right back at you. So thank you for, again, for joining us. And I hope whoever, does listen to this, whoever this message does get across, they do take into consideration a lot of the wisdom and insight that you imparted. So thank you again. And if any of you have closing remarks, we can end it here.
No, not really. I again re-emphasize and thank you for focusing this episode on patriotism. I think that's what we really need at the end. And when I was in Afghanistan serving in the Islamic Republic, each time I would be appointed, there would be this form to fill out and then identify my ethnicity. I would never do that. I would always put Afghan. And that form would somehow be rejected or returned, or I would get called and being asked, to identify. And I would say, no, this is who I am. I have all ethnicities in me, and being an Afghan represents the whole. So being an Afghan is synonymous with diversity. So why do I need to say where I'm from, what locality, what region, what sect, what this, what that? No, Afghan. We need to feel and identify foremost as Afghan. And yeah, local identities are fine that because they were in a diverse nation, but realizing the fact that unless we feel and act and work and collaborate and partner patriotically, it's impossible to achieve our common goal. As noble as it is, as much as we all wanted that, because ultimately external players, and it's their in self-interest to exploit our diversities to create divisions and to provoke all these issues of separatism or identism and whatnot to prevent Afghans from coming together, rallying around a leader or leaders that are emerging to reclaim and regain what has been lost over the past 2 years, and to bring also ultimately the Taliban into the fold and make them realize that it's their and their shared interest and that of their families and their future in this and Afghan makeup to move forward together. So thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you, and I look forward to discussing future topics with you and others down the road. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those final insights. It's truly discussions like these that enrich our understanding, strengthen our resolve. And as Varjan mentioned, your kind words and acknowledgement mean a great deal, especially coming from a leader as esteemed as yourself. It's a reminder that for me that leadership isn't just about a position or power. It's about that shared journey of learning, understanding, and striving for a better future. Um, Both Zubairjan and I think I can say this on his behalf as well, as young voices in this ongoing dialogue, are inspired by your leaders like yourself, who pave the way with such wisdom and resilience. So thank you. And as we conclude today's episode, I just I'm very touched by the depth of our conversation. And so, to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey. Your presence and engagement, as always, is what makes these conversations impactful. We hope that today's episode has provided you with insights and inspiration, just like it has for us and stay connected with us for more discussions. Until next time, let's keep the flame of hope and resistance alive. Goodbye and take care. Khuda Hafiz.